This segment of the Chopin podcast is brought to you by the Chopin Foundation of the United States, presenters of the National Chopin Competition in Miami, Florida, January 2025. I want to take you back to the very first episode of the Chopin podcast, where Garrick Olson, in his typical modesty, had a confession to make.
Sometimes people ask me if I improvise, and I say, no, I don't know how, and they say, what do you mean? Well, actually, improvisations in the musical disciplines where they're still used, you're taught how to improvise. In other words, I think it's been pointed out that every pianist in the time of Mozart, Beethoven, and even Chopin had yards of passage work they could just fit into anything they were doing, because the whole idea of, we think in the modern ideas, you're improvising. Oh, you're inspirationalizing. You're so good. You're just making it all up on the spot. Well, I don't know. I think even major geniuses sometimes need a little filler that they can count on as they go to the next idea.
What Garrick is saying here is a really important point and helps to expose a pernicious assumption about improvisation that's prevalent in the classical world. Whenever it's pointed out that Mozart, Beethoven, Chopin, and the like were great improvisers, it's used as evidence of their towering genius, not anything we mere mortals could aspire to. Yet the truth is, genius has as little to do with improvising as it does with learning a language. As musicologist Robert Yerdingen has documented, in the 18th century, countless 10-year-old orphan boys were being pulled off the streets in Italy and taught how to improvise, putting them on track to fulfill roles in society as professional musicians. They were taught the grammar of music through solfeggio, the rule of the octave, and partimento, techniques that would go on to form the basis of the Paris Conservatory curriculum and were foundational in spreading fluency in a common musical language across an entire continent. So how does one learn to improvise, and why are we spending so much time on the topic in a series dedicated to finished, notated masterworks? For answers to those questions, I will defer once again to Noam Sivan, professor of improvisation at the State University for Music and the Performing Arts in Stuttgart. Noam is a multi-dimensional virtuoso, one of the only people you'll ever meet who can perform Schubert's Wanderer Fantasy or the Liszt Sonata, and then turn around and improvise a piece of comparable length and intricate design on the spot. And on top of that, he'll tell you exactly how he did it and how you could do it too. I was fortunate to get to pick Noam's brain for the better part of an hour in a recent interview, in which he reimagined a couple of Chopin impromptus before working his way backwards through a crash course in historical improvisation.
This is indeed a fascinating topic, and we have to remember that the repertoire that now is so well known grew out of a tradition of improvisation. Chopin improvised, others in his time, Mendelssohn, Liszt, improvised regularly in concerts. Carl Czerny wrote an important book on improvisation in the 1830s. His Opus 200, the pianist's systematic guide to improvisation. So testimonies we have like Delacroix or Fontana, who heard Chopin improvise and reflect on it. This is what we have. We don't have recordings. Obviously, I do think that when Chopin improvised, he was able to stay longer with the musical material, so that there are no restrictions of the composition that you need to move to the next section. And that's why we have eyewitness accounts that he improvised at quite length, and the improvisations went on and they were highly inspired. And then when he sat down and wrote it on paper, sometimes he took great care to write the same measure over and over, and then he changed his mind. He sent it to a publisher, then he changed again, then he taught it to students, then he changed his mind again. So there was this constant state of rethinking about the music, but of course in an improvisation it just happens once. So we cannot know, but I can believe that they were, let's say, bolder, or maybe sometimes highly inspired, experimental, going in lots of interesting directions. And we don't know if all of them found their way into his compositions.
Surely. His friend from childhood, Julian Fontana, writes that the richness of Chopin's improvisation was astonishing, he says, but he took good care not to parade it. And the few lucky ones who have heard him improvising for hours on end in the most wonderful manner, never lifting a single phrase from any other composer, never even touching on any of his own works. Those people will agree with us in saying that Chopin's most beautiful finished compositions are merely reflections and echoes of his improvisation. This spontaneous inspiration was like an inexhaustible torrent of precious materials and ferment. From time to time, the master would draw out of it a few cups to throw into his mold, and these were found to be full of pearls and rubies. There, I think Fontana is suggesting that he's giving priority and precedence to Chopin's improvisations and almost saying, look, the compositions are kind of an afterthought. The main show was what we lucky ones got to hear. Now, obviously, these testimonials are self-serving and romantic, and they might be embellished, but still, we get this sense that he was really coming up with astonishing things on the spot that we'll never hear. Well, we could never even dream of, perhaps.
Well, there is something I like about the Fontana quote, and I prefer to look at it more optimistically than pessimistically, because you say, oh, there's all this great music that we lost. But I look at it, wow, there was so much inner life to the improvisations. And for me, it just gives me more energy and motivation to start improvising and exploring the material and exploring the musical language. And then we understand, well, you have to put it down on paper. You have to finish the composition. This is one version. And I prefer this approach to the approach of the piece had to be this way. That was the only possibility. That was the only way. And he could not have changed a single note. I understand that we need something of that when we play the piece in concert and we prepare and we practice. Yes, we need something of that approach. But I think we've gone too far in this direction and forgetting that the music came from this kind of freshness of improvisation. And I think that when we do improvise with the material, then when we go back to the piece, we understand what the musical language was. The melodies and the harmonies, and then we know that the composition is just one version. I can give another analogy. I don't know if it's useful, but I will just say, when we are born, when we come into this world, we know that during time of conception, there could be lots of different sperms and lots of different possibilities of people that could emerge, and thousands of them. But then one of them makes it. And then we're here by miracle or something. And then there are all of those other people that could have been born, and they could have had different talents and different ideas and different personalities and lots of different things, and all emanating from the same source. So in music, you could improvise today like this, tomorrow like that, in a different way. And one of them ends up being on paper, and that's the piece, and then that's what gets known. But then there are all of these other versions that are equally interesting. And I think this is a much more fluid way of dealing with the material, and for me, much more fascinating.
Well, I wonder if we can maybe turn to the piano and kind of put this into practice a bit. This episode is ostensibly about impromptus. And of course, the idea of an impromptu is a kind of spontaneous thing. And certainly, I think Chopin's impromptus, like many of his works, feel like they grow out of improvisatory practices. I particularly love the F sharp major. The opening feels to me like Chopin. I can hear him just maybe beginning with his left hand one day over a cup of coffee one morning. It's just, let's see what I can do with this. Would you mind maybe sharing just that opening if you have it, and maybe playing a little bit of what Chopin did, and consider some alternatives too, some of these other sperm that didn't quite make the cut, if you will. Cool. So it began as Chopin and then it became one of Sivan's creations, but it always had Chopin's, I guess there's kind of a ground base to this theme. And you sort of took off in flight above that in different variations. Is that right?
Yeah. And I was thinking whether I should, knowing the piece, whether I should follow the course of it or not. And then eventually I chose to go back to the opening as a recurring point of reference, and then each time proceed in a different direction. It's really interesting in the impromptus because we know the material and we think it's like that. It was always like this. It could only be done in this way. And then if we look at it slightly differently, then we learn the material can do lots of other things. For example, if we think of the middle section of Impromptu number 1, and it starts forte, and then later still within the middle section, we have different kind of material. So if we can think what could happen to the material differently, let's say just start in a different key. Let's do A flat minor. Potentially coming back to an opening section that is maybe in a relative major.
Oh, I love it. I heard a little bit of a Nocturne Opus 62-1 when it turns into trills in a little bit towards the end. I mean, I can tell, obviously, you've played an enormous amount of Chopin in your life. You've studied the works, but you've also imbibed and become fluent in something underneath that music, the language that it's expressing on the surface in the scores. And I wonder if you could speak to that. I mean, what's going on harmonically, motivically, melodically, and if you can try to introspect a bit and actually describe the sensation, the process. I don't know if it's a process, but the experience of manifesting this at the keyboard.
It's a big topic, and I would say less mysterious than what people normally think. And I will start actually with a language analogy. So when you learn French, Chinese, German, Spanish, any foreign language, and then putting the words together, understanding the meaning of the words, words into sentences, sentences into paragraphs, we learn to read, we learn to write, we learn to speak, we approach it from different angles until we have enough mastery to, let's say, run a basic conversation, and later, if it's on a higher level, yes, to give a speech, to write a poem, to write an essay, and so forth. So what happens now when we talk? We improvise, right? We improvise with the language and connecting the language and the ideas. In music, those things are melodies and harmonies. I mean, I'm simplifying, of course. There is much more, but if we talk about this musical language, and we have melodic material and harmonic material, and then they create little phrases. So in the process of learning, we learn how you connect chords together and how you develop melodic material, and then you learn to put the two together. And then in the process of improvising, at any moment, there are different possibilities. Maybe I can just demonstrate a beginning, and then we can see where it continues. I will start with something that can be the beginning of an impromptu. Now, for example, at this point, I started with a phrase and then I went back to the opening. So when I come back to it second time, I can change the harmony. So that it continues differently. And at this point, we had the first phrase. What do we do next? We can start with the same melodic idea. But we don't have to. We can also, after we got to the cadence, start with something completely new. We say might be a little bit too radical, but it's nevertheless a possibility. And then later we have to find a way to reconcile the two. I'll just present a third option. Let's say we are at the cadence. Let's say I present the second phrase, the B phrase. Maybe at this point the piece would start gaining momentum and lead to something else.
So if I could make an observation, it seems like where you're at, if it's continuing the language analogy, is you're sort of coaching how one might develop their already learned linguistic capacities towards making an argument or conveying an idea or writing an essay or speaking out a kind of. Before that, there had to be one had to gain a basic fluency with the vocabulary, with the articulation of the words, and with that mysterious and amazing thing we all learn as kids, as speakers. No matter how brilliant or ordinary one might be in their mental capacities, we all have this incredible capacity for language, just to start speaking it and assimilating that. In your own training as a musician, did you learn these sort of elements of the grammar and vocabulary at the keyboard, or did you study the sort of music theory elements? I know you said you approached from all angles, but to be able to know that this is the harmony or that this is the note I should even start on, but before you've made your little melody in B major, for example, that required some amount of ear training and theory. But I took those things in conservatory, and I can't improvise. So what's different? What was different in your training that gave you those basic elements of vocabulary and grammar such that you could even begin to speak fluently?
Maybe first I will start with simplifying the example to show how this relates to more basic musical elements, and then I will answer the question. When we start improvising, then I play the second half of the verse. So that is a simplified melody that is not very different from simplified versions of Chopin melodies. And this is something that you can start practicing, or musicians, pianists can start practicing with just not much theory knowledge, but just playing the repertoire, learning about major and minor scales, 8-measure phrases, and some scale degrees, and then you're good to go. And with the harmony, it's similar. I have the chords. So there is knowledge of keyboard harmony that, of course, helps with understanding the music.
Were you trained with any specific kinds of models for improvisation? Obviously, in history, we have things like partimento, we have different kinds of figured bass exercises, things like that. And Chopin was exposed to different versions of these as a youth. What was it for you? I'm just curious, because you have that kind of fluency, even the way you were just like, oh yes, and now with harmonies. Even that was beautiful. It was already voiced nicely. You chose chromatics with voice leading in just such a way. Right. So
notice I played them in several successive levels of complexity. So I first just played 1, 4, 5, 1, then I played a little bit more, and then a little bit more, sort of showing the levels of what you can do with chords. So you start with 1, 4, 5, 1, and then you learn circle of fifth, and then you learn 6 chords inversions, and then you learn secondary dominants, and sort of you learn the vocabulary. And this is something that people do, or they should be doing when they go to conservatory training and they learn keyboard harmony, and then they can play the chords. But what often they do not learn, or the teachers do not emphasize, is that it's not just the chords, but chords connected with melodic material, and then with eighth notes and triplets and rhythms and the things that bring it to create music. But this is how people learned back then. Now, with regard to my own path, I would start by just saying that I had a passion for learning as much as I can about music. And this informed a lot of what I did. So some things I picked up from standard classes that I took on harmony and modulations, things like that, or keyboard harmony, those kinds of things, analysis. And I played a lot of repertoire. I sight read a lot of repertoire. And I asked a lot of questions, why the composer did this or not that, and it could have gone this way. I remember when I was 14, 15, I went practice the piano, and my mother was cooking in the kitchen, and she was my piano teacher, and I played something, and I asked, why did Chopin choose this chord and not the other chord? And sometimes she came up with an answer, sometimes not, but it was something that interested me. I wanted to learn how this music is put together and why. And at first, there was nothing much in terms of, let's say, systematic training in this. This something that came bit by bit throughout my studies. At some point, I did learn with Professor Karl Schachter, who encouraged me to improvise, and I worked with him for 2 years on tonal improvisation, which was very helpful. And then I got to meet people who improvise and people who teach improvisation. And I started to, it's just something, it's something that grew gradually through composing, analyzing, playing, asking questions, listening to music, approaching it from different directions. It's not just sitting at the piano and improvising, but it's just immersing myself in music in a very, I would say, very passionate way of just, I wanted to learn music to the end. At some point, I realized that there is no end, but I wanted to get there. And I think that this thirst for knowledge is what helped me to gain the nuances of learning the language on a deeper level.
You've taught a lot of students, and in fact, you've taught a lot of some of the greatest pianists. Yuja Wang was one of your students at Curtis in improvisation class when you were a teacher there. You taught at Juilliard, and when I was there, many of my friends would hail your class, and I regret never taking it. I was probably just too afraid of improvising. I still am. But I wonder, you talk about your own spark you had, this kind of native interest, this curiosity. Some would say that's not taught. That's very hard to inspire in someone. You're born with that kind of curiosity. But you've taught a lot of students, and I'm sure you've seen a range of curiosity from them. And I imagine, because I'm a teacher myself, when you get the ones who maybe don't seem to have the spark as much, you want them to experience that. And it doesn't always work, but have you found ways of trying to get even those who don't have a native curiosity for these things, who don't think to begin with, oh, I have to get to the end of music, right? Are there ways of even drawing out that out of them? Maybe you could speak to that just pedagogically.
Sure. First, I will say the will to improvise is natural. And when you start playing music, when you're 5, 6 years old and you go to the piano or to any other instrument, you want to improvise. That's what you want to do. That's the first thing. And then people start telling you, okay, you have to learn to read, you have to, then it gets structured. But it starts with the urge of improvising and making music. And this is something I believe that is always there. Even if it's covered with layers of confidence problems and insecurities and all kinds of other problems that the system instilled in us, but it's there. And then it doesn't matter whether you are 10 or 20 or 40 or 60. If you are willing to give it a try, then you can start at any point. And I have started with students at different points in their lives, from, you said, concert pianists who say, I want to add improvisation to my activities. And some of them have been doing it, and it leads to wonderful results. They add anchors in their concerts and they put it in their programs. Alex just did that. As you know, Alex Gagiev, he did improvisation recitals. And after we worked for a number of years, and it's wonderful. And some other people say, no, I just want to learn it as a way to deepen my musicianship. And then we learn about how to create melodies and how to create harmonies. And the joy of discovering is really what makes it fascinating from a teacher's perspective and from a student's perspective is that it's okay to make mistakes. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to sound like Chopin. It doesn't have to sound like Bach. It doesn't have to be that, but it's working with the building blocks of music and creating something out of it. Like in a sandbox, when you play and you just take the toys and you create games and you watch children at the age of 3 and 4, so imaginative, creating their own games and just the mind is so much alive. So the human mind is amazing. We do have this ability, and it's just a matter of finding the path and then doing it with musical notes, and then beautiful things come out of it.
I'm somebody who's found myself in YouTube comment sections on my own videos defending composition, actually, not against those who are promoting improvisation, but maybe challenging those who say that the purest and highest form of music making is improvisation. I'm somebody who always loved Glenn Gould, and Gould was a master of calculation, of formulation, of coming up with exactly his plan for an interpretation. And even he approached performance as a composer, and he even spoke on occasion against trends in the 1960s of improvisation that he thought were ultimately harmful to one's individuality, because they drew on mere devices of that were very common in the language, and although it might feel like you're being free, in fact you're simply speaking in cliches, for example. And so he's on record as saying that, and I think that one might run that risk of believing one is being free when in fact one is spouting cliches. We do it in language all the time. Actually, we think we're making an argument that's our own, but it's something we read somewhere and we're spouting somebody else's ideas. But truly, I see the beauty in both. And I think really I'm just ashamed that I can't improvise as well as as you and others. But at the end of the day, these are part of the same fabric of musicianship, or at least they should be, if we can speak normatively. Could you just comment on that, if it's even a debate? I mean, that sort of question, that tension between the beauties and the humanity of improvisation, and that the heights one can achieve in improvisation versus, or in complement to, the heights one can achieve in pre-formulated composition.
We talked about the testimonies of Chopin, and of course there were similar ones at the time of Beethoven when he improvised, and Bach when he improvised. There is a famous quote by his son Wilhelm Friedman Bach that his improvisations were even more devout and solemn and magnificent than his comparable written compositions. And we see that improvisation was held as the highest form of music making at the same time that these pieces were composed and the pieces that we are playing today. So then it means that they saw this, okay, you learn composition, you learn performance, and then you learn to put the two together. And that's music making in a very pure way. Now, in a composition, you can rely on cliches. In improvisation, you can rely on cliches. In composition, you have those who can handle it better and worse. In improvisation, you can have those who can handle it better or worse. So in the same way that you have better or worse performers. So I prefer to look at improvisation and composition as two ways of making music that enhance each other. I don't see any competition here. So for me, composition is strong with structure, the ability to bring back things, to have this non-linear thinking, and of course, the more you have, you have more instruments and more complexity and all of that. But composition sometimes struggles with spontaneity, with naturalness. And of course, the let's say the good composers, what they're doing is working very hard to make their compositions sound natural and flowing. Improvisation is very strong in transitions. It's very strong in inspiration, in flow, in richness of ideas and in this liveliness of making music. Of course, it's harder in improvisation to work on structure. It's not impossible. There are exercises, there are things that you can do. And in my own practice, I've done improvisations that were, 35 minutes, full movement sonatas and things like that. So there are ways to put improvisation in something that's known as a composition form, as a composed form. But improvisation can learn from composition, and composition can learn from improvisation. And in an ideal world, both flourish and coexist.